One of the world's rarest plants grows in this thicket. Its habitat destroyed, the leaves eaten by goats, the café marron was thought to be extinct. This single plant was discovered by a schoolboy in 1980. Without protection, it would by now have gone, its unique genetic potential lost forever.
But then there's an awful lot of plants that you say, well, they're very interesting, but they're not related to anything we actually use. But are they important? And the big thing is people say, well, for medicine, but you know, the cure for AIDS could be residing in one of these plants, these endemic plants.
Our future, like our past, depends on plants. Without them, we won't survive. By transforming the sun's energy, plants feed, clothe, and protect us. They recycle water, oxygen, and other vital elements. They moderate the climate and make life possible for myriad other organisms, including us. How best to use plants to understand their true value and their fantastic potential remains a vital quest for every generation. The people of the Andes have understood the power of the sun and its effect on their plant resources for thousands of years. This ancient sun festival is still led by the king, the Inca, as it has been for centuries. Today, people come from all over the world to mingle with Peruvians, for whom this is one of the most important days of the year. The Incas and their descendants also celebrate the diversity of plants that the sun's energy supports. Farming here has very ancient origins, and today they produce a multitude of different crops, many of them as exotic and unusual to the rest of us as the sun festival itself. But some are more familiar. Outside the Andean region, the rest of the world uses a handful of different varieties of potato. Here in Peru, there are over 3,000, each with its own peculiarities and uses. Some special potato varieties can be stored after sun drying. First, they have to be prepared in the traditional way. Having many varieties is the basis of food security. If some fail through bad weather or disease, there are always others that are less affected, guaranteeing the supply of this vital food crop. Today, potatoes are one of the most widely used crops in the world. If we need new varieties for a changing climate or to resist disease, it is here in Peru that we will need to look, though few people realize this.
Where did potatoes come from, John? I don't know. Ireland. The ground.
Potatoes, are they from Ireland? I think, well, I don't know. I think they're from Ireland, aren't they?
Neil should have kept walking.
Do you know how many different varieties of potato there are approximately?
I have no idea. I'd guess at 20.
Potatoes, like many other crops, can be found in markets all over the world. Throughout history, crops have traveled from country to country, exchanged by farmers and carried abroad by migrants, explorers and the wind. The global village has become the global kitchen. Pizza is now a popular food in cities all over the world. But imagine pizza without tomatoes or peppers. 400 years ago, there were neither tomatoes nor peppers in Italy, let alone pizza. As well as potatoes and tomatoes, Latin America has also contributed other major crops like maize, sweet potatoes, cassava, peanuts and beans to the global kitchen. While Western Asia has added wheat, barley, faba beans, grapes and several others. The rest of Asia provided rice, tea, soya, coconut, bananas, sugarcane and many spices. Africa has contributed millet, sorghum, yams and coffee. Other parts of the world have contributed rather less. Northern Europe, oats, broccoli and Brussels sprouts, while North America has provided only pecan nuts, sunflower seeds and cranberries. For the crowds enjoying the Sun Festival, rice and spaghetti made from wheat are now just as popular as their own potatoes and tomatoes. All these crops have become adapted to their new homes over the centuries, as farmers have carefully selected and bred them in their own fields. It's a process that continues today, which is why this diversity of hereditary material, known as plant genetic resources, is fundamental to our future survival in a changing world.
They provide us with the options that we're going to need in the future. The options to develop new crops, newer, more productive crops, crops that are resistant to pests and diseases. New pests are going to come along, we know that. Yet we need to find new ways of fighting those pests and maintaining our supplies of food and other resources. Without the genetic diversity, without that basic variability, we are not going to be able to meet those sorts of challenges. We're going to find ourselves locked into a corner.
Every part of the world has plant genetic resources that humanity may someday need. This is what scientists mean when they say that countries are interdependent with regard to plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. Our global kitchen depends on global diversity.
If you don't have diversity within the crops that you're dealing with, you're not going to get anywhere. You cannot make a selection of things that are uniform. Everything will be the same, so what's the point? So you need diversity to make progress. Breeding is based on that. Diversity is the base of breeding. You need diversity in the species that you deal with. And the 20 basic species that are the main source of the human calories, we need lots of diversity in those. And it's thanks to the existing diversity that we could get the human population fed to the point it is right now.
But that diversity we depend on is disappearing rapidly around the world due to a combination of human and environmental factors. The implications for agriculture and the security of the world's food supply are frightening.
Where we at is that 800 million people went to bed hungry last night. Every third preschool child in developing countries is malnourished. These children, about 185 million of them, don't grow well. They are frequently ill. About 30 to 35,000 of them die every day from nutrition-related illnesses. That's where we are. We are tearing down the natural resources. We are causing soil erosion, forest deforestation. We are not using the water appropriately, the water that is available. So we're not doing very well on the natural resource side either. Where are we going? It depends on what we do. If we continue to sit back, complacently expecting things to take care of themselves, then they will, and we will be sorry.
In 1992, the deteriorating state of the world's environment was put on the international agenda at the Second Earth Summit. The threats of climate change and losses of biological diversity were two of the main items on the agenda.
We have been the most successful species ever. We are now a species out of control. Our very success is leading us to the dangerous future that has brought us here.
One result was the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has now been ratified by over 170 countries. The aims were to conserve biological diversity, to make the best sustainable use of diversity, and to ensure a fair and equitable distribution of the benefits. Ambitious aims, but difficult to achieve.
The best way we have to save our biodiversity into perpetuity, and perhaps the only way, is to put this biodiversity to work for society, for intellectual, for spiritual, for economic purposes, whatever. But biodiversity has to be known and valued.
One country that has learned to value biodiversity is India, where many indigenous plants have been cherished for centuries. Here, the mango is so popular, there are special festivals to celebrate the hundreds of different varieties.
I'm from Maharashtra, yes, and my favorite is Alfonso. Just for color, for pulp, and it is called the king of mangoes.
From Langras to Chausa and Raspuri to Alfonso, each one is unique. There is something here for everyone, sweet or sour, and from juice to chutney. Some have good flesh and others are great for pulp. In the marquee, it's one of the pulp varieties that draws the crowd. 1 minute to get through 3 kilos of ripe fruit, and without softening them up first.
Go!
At any time, eating 3 kilos of mangoes in a hurry is a slippery prospect. The finer points of technique are soon lost in the excitement.
It was a great fun. You could eat some more.
Yeah, I can eat more than 5 kg.
The popularity of the mango eating contest serves to attract many people to the serious business, a display of the amazing diversity of mangoes that are available. One species, but over 600 different varieties, provided by some of the country's leading growers. Their interest turns to new features like pest resistance or high yield and special taste, but to the general public, it's the chance to appreciate a very special part of Indian heritage. But what makes one mango smooth and another wrinkly, and how these characteristics are inherited, puzzled scientists for centuries. As he admitted, Charles Darwin built his theory of evolution without understanding the process of inheritance. But he did recognize the importance of diversity, especially in crops and domesticated animals. It was another man who first unraveled the mysteries of inheritance. In a monastery at Brno, one of the monks started making careful observations and recording them. It was in the 1860s when this abbot's predecessor was the gardener and botanist Gregor Mendel. Today, part of the monastery is a museum in his honor. Fascinated by the differences in peas, Mendel started excluding the bees and controlling the pollination himself. Crossing a smooth pea with a wrinkled pea, he first produced a generation that was all smooth. But when these smooth ones were fertilized with their own pollen, mysteriously some wrinkled offspring appeared, always in the same ratio, 1 to 3. He concluded that inheritance depended on paired genetic characters, and that a recessive character, roughness in the case of peas, could be present without being expressed, but would surely reappear later in following generations in the same ratio. Forgotten for 30 years, Mendel's work was only rediscovered in the early years of this century. Yet it was his breakthrough that led to the whole modern science of genetics. Scientists have since developed Mendel's ideas and now understand that living organisms often have a treasure trove of genetic resources hidden from sight. Plant diversity has a genetic explanation, offering enormous potential both for selection and crossbreeding. Techniques are now available by which the genetic makeup of individual plants can be directly compared and their genetic differences revealed. Specially prepared samples are laid out in a tray, then a weak electric current is applied. This spreads out fragments of the DNA that holds the genetic code of each sample, and the genetic fingerprints appear as a series of rows. These DNA fingerprinting techniques could help scientists identify specific traits that can be used to resist pests or increase yields. The genetic information may also provide clues to a plant's geographic origins. Mendel revealed the secret of plant pollination, the process by which genetic material is exchanged between plants. These genetic messengers maintain the flow of genes between plants by carrying pollen. At the Desert Museum in Tucson, Arizona, scientists have made a special study of pollinators, both for crops and for wild plants.
Pollinators are extremely important in terms of the food we eat, the fibers, cotton fibers on our clothing, some beverages, some medicines. We literally owe about 1/3 of everything we eat, of all of our crops, to pollination by insects, especially bees. This is an immature fruit, a gourd of what we call buffalo gourd, and it's one of about 5 species of local native gourds in southern Arizona. The reason this plant is so important is that its flowers provide vital nectar and pollen for native bees that we call squash and gourd bees. In this area we have probably the richest bee real estate in the world, perhaps 1,200 species of native ground nesting bees. And by the farmer here, an organic farmer, leaving these in place, he provides vital food for these bees, which in turn move on to his pumpkins and other cultivated cucurbits. So by leaving these weeds alone, he's providing vital pollination services for his cultivated pumpkins, zucchinis, and other squashes.
We have very different patterns of genetic diversity within a cultivated plant, depending on the abundance of pollinators and what kind of pollinators are the predominant kind, helping with this service of transferring the genetic material from one plant to another. And this saguaro cactus is actually a good example of that, because nectar-feeding bats, white-winged doves, honeybees, or wild bees can be the pollinators. And those bats fly very long distance and can pollinate plants even kilometers between individual plants. So the cross-pollination creates this very large gene pool. Honeybees are restricted to just a kilometer or two in their travel distances. Some of the wild bees might only move the pollen from this plant to one 50 meters away. So the genetic structure of a plant population is very different depending on who pollinates it. In areas where there's constant spraying of pesticides, perhaps every 8 days during the cotton flowering season in northern Mexico, we see a huge decline in the numbers of moths and butterflies that are visiting flowering plants. And we're concerned about that because in many cases they're more effective pollinators than bees are.
With such a vital role, any decline in pollinators can have unforeseen consequences for the survival of wild plants as well as for crops. Around the world, many species of plants are collected from the wild for food and to prepare medicines and cosmetics. Demand everywhere for such products is increasing, and some wild plant species are now becoming scarce. In Mexico, vast quantities of medicinal plants are gathered from the wild. It's big business, especially in the major cities, but prices are rising. In some areas, overexploitation has virtually denuded the countryside of certain species.
Most of the plants are gathered, and then they go to the wild and gather the plants, but they don't cultivate them. And sometimes they said in the past they were a lot, and now you cannot find them.
Since many tons are collected daily, this is perhaps not surprising. The use of medicinal plants in Mexico is probably greater than in any other country, except India and China.
We still don't know how many we have. We think they are around 3,500 because Mexico is such a big country and with different, nearly 60 different ethnic groups. And each group has their own knowledge about the medicinal plants.
Ethnobotanist Edelmira Linares studies plant lore and the agricultural customs and knowledge of the local people. She combs the markets regularly for new finds and tries to assess the availability of different plants. And she's always on the lookout for unusual plants for sale.
Some of these plants are don't set seed, for example, because we don't have the pollinators or because the pollinators are not available in the wild. That could be another thing, that if those places are close to cultivated fields and they are spraying, some of the wild pollinators, they don't live anymore. They die with the other pests.
Queda como macollo. Es muy macolluda. Muy macolluda. De corte más no. Bueno, hoy descubrí algo bueno. Zacate chichi, qué bueno, lo voy a tener siempre en mente.
Sometimes we go to the communities and we try to convince them that it's rare. Maybe they could cultivate themselves. And some of them, you don't have to work hardly. They know that. They go and get seeds and then cultivate them at home as other plants. And now they are cultivated.
One example of this is the Mexican species of arnica, a painkiller which has recently become very scarce in the countryside near Osumba. Arnica seller Laura Mendez collected seed last year from Morelos State and now sells from her own farm. She took Edelmira to see her field. Cultivation of arnica may help to ensure that the species is conserved and will take the pressure off the wild populations which have become so reduced they are difficult to find.
Sí, y eso que lo fumiga mi esposo cada 8 días.
¿Ah, sí?
Sí.
This is probably how agriculture began. Seeds that had been harvested from the wild for generations were sown in a specially prepared field. Cultivated varieties developed from their wild relatives as farmers selected for characteristics they favored. One area where this process resulted in particularly important crops was that part of Western Asia known as the Fertile Crescent. Wheat and barley developed here from wild ancestors, and they are celebrated on buildings all over the region. Since the beginning of agriculture 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, the genetic makeup of farmers' varieties or land races has changed. So today's crops are very different from the wild plants they've come from. Modern wheat looks completely different. It's more robust and has larger seeds. By selecting the characteristics they needed, traditional farmers have produced diversity of wheat upon which the varieties found all over the world today are based. In recent years, modern plant breeding has tended to standardize the major crops, concentrating on a small number of special types the farmers feel they can trust. So today, just a handful of high-yielding varieties of wheat, rice and maize have replaced literally hundreds of traditional varieties. But it's not just the major grains that have become mass-produced. Food production was revolutionized in the 1960s, when high-yielding, reliable modern varieties of many major crops first became available. As farmers replaced their traditional varieties, they unknowingly discarded plants containing combinations of genes that had been shaped by nature and by their ancestors for generations. This loss of diversity, or genetic erosion, was not immediately seen as a problem.
At that time, the thinking was, how can we increase production? How can we increase yields? And the legislation was looking at the new high-yielding varieties. And everybody at the administration, at the European Community at that time thought, we have to force farmers into progress. And that means let them take just the high-yielding varieties and not their old traditional ones. People thought that was a good idea, so they would increase the yields. Nobody was thinking of genetic erosion that could happen. And that perhaps varieties that were high-yielding had other risks, losing their resistance or whatever.
Near Coventry in England, the Heritage Seed Library was set up to redress the balance disturbed by modern agriculture.
Because the genetic resources in Europe, not just worldwide, but in Europe, and as far as we're concerned, particularly UK, are so threatened, we have to do something about it. So we have set up what amounts to a club, where we maintain some 800 or so varieties which are not legally permitted to be sold within Europe. And we offer them to people who join the club so that they can have them available and keep our heritage alive. All modern plant breeding is essentially done for the commercial grower. There isn't a lot of money in producing a variety for amateurs unless you can sell an awful lot of it. So generally speaking, amateurs now are only getting the option of what fell out of the breeding program when they were trying to find something for commercial growing. What they're looking for there is things that all ripen at the same time, that are uniform and standard, can be machine harvested and all those sort of things, none of which are of any value to the back gardener whatsoever. And our experience with our collection is that many of the old varieties are far superior because the flavour is far better than modern varieties, which in general are bred not particularly for flavour, but for appearance and harvestability and all the other things that the grower needs. We've even been approached by one of the leading breeders in the country saying our French beans, or whatever it is that they're growing for processing, don't have any flavour. Can we see what you've got? This is actually quite a good sign, and the fact that we've got them and these might then go back into cultivation is definitely a good thing. And the fact that awareness has been raised, I hope, with those people concerned that you know, we're treasuring a rather rare resource, and this is all on a very slender thread. I hope that that has had some impact too. The excitement of finding a new variety that somebody's kept in their family for generations, it's fascinating. The history of vegetables is no less important, in my view, than the history of kings and queens. It actually tells you far more about the social structure of the country, and it deals with people far removed from all the political arguments. what we, I think, really feel we're doing is saving valuable genetic resources. It's so important to hang on to these things because we have no idea what we might need in the future in terms of breeding programs if the climate changes, which is the thing that everybody's talking about at the moment. So it's just not good enough to throw this stuff away and say, well, it's old, therefore it's valueless. It's extremely valuable.
Another man who's concerned about the loss of traditional varieties is Paul Hand, apple detective. Based near Ludlow in the west of England, he searches old orchards for rare or lost varieties.
No blemish on that one, Paul, whatsoever. You'd think that it's bound to be sprayed, but it hasn't seen a bit of spray or a bit of fertiliser in its life, I wouldn't think.
Paul has single-handedly saved several old varieties thought to have become extinct.
This is the Onybury Pippin, and it's an old Victorian variety of apple. Nobody's sure exactly when it originated. Grown quite widely in Herefordshire, but has been lost until very recently. And I came across it because people told me about the tree here. I was told that actually it was a seedling planted by an old man who lived here and was very keen on grafting and all sorts of fruit. And that perhaps it was just a seedling that he had developed and not a particularly important variety in genetic history. But when I got here, I found that the tree was older than the man himself and actually covered in these really rather fantastic flavoured apples. And it jumped right to the top of my list of favourite apples with a flavour like lemon meringue pie and a very healthy, well-growing variety. I've actually taken grafting material and grafted some myself at home in the nursery. As soon as we've got one that's in good condition, we'll send it down to the National Collection at Brogdale, where all of the important apple varieties in England have been kept.
But many others have already been lost, replaced by the few standard commercial types, an erosion of the total genetic diversity of apples.
When we talk of genetic erosion, it's not just the varieties themselves, it's the genetics, the characteristics in different varieties. That is, resistance is very important. Taste, just think of Dutch tomatoes. Taste had gone. There was high yield, but not necessarily taste. Certain characteristics also for cooking, how you can, or conservation. Certain varieties conserve better. Just look at the new apples. You just get a few varieties now. There are still apple varieties, but not on the market, which conserve a very long time. You can harvest them in October, and they are still fresh and good, and in March, April. So those are different characteristics which have just disappeared, and that's a question of course, of security. If you rely on just a very few varieties, you might just at some point find out that there's a big disease destroying that, and what do you rely on then? Think of the example of Ireland. The big hunger in Ireland was linked to that question of a very reduced variety of potatoes.
What happened in Ireland 150 years ago was a disaster unequalled in the history of crops. Although the potato was the staple crop in the early 1800s, it had only reached Ireland from South America just over 200 years before. It was introduced to Britain by Sir Walter Raleigh, along with tobacco and tomatoes. The potato was an immediate success, but he could never have guessed the terrible tragedy it would cause. In the high Andes, there are thousands of potato varieties. Few serious plant diseases occur here, and there are so many different sorts that no disease ever affects more than a few. Of all the different varieties available, Raleigh brought just one. The crop that was to feed Ireland came from just a handful of parent tubers. And in the damp lowlands of Ireland, the potato thrived where wheat could never ripen. It became overwhelmingly the main crop of the island. But the humidity attracted fungal diseases, and the one variety grown in Ireland proved highly susceptible to these attacks. The most virulent disease was called late blight. An attack would ruin the crop in record time, killing the plants from leaf to tuber. In 1846, there was an attack of late blight. Field after field of potatoes was struck down, and a nation went hungry. Without alternative varieties, the same potatoes were planted again the next year, with late blight already infesting much of the land. This time, the entire agricultural production failed. Misfortune had turned to disaster. With virtually no other food, the people starved. No modern relief effort was available. 3 million died in the Great Hunger. Another 3 million emigrated. Evidence of the tragedy remains in the Irish countryside even today. Recently, more aggressive strains of late blight have attacked potato crops in North and South America, Europe, Asia and Africa, sparing only Australia, creating alarm in many places. As part of a global late blight initiative, scientists are searching for resistance among the enormous diversity of Andean potatoes. In mid-1997, a team at the International Potato Center in Lima, Peru, harvested a new set of experimental potatoes expected to be resistant to all existing forms of late blight disease. Without such efforts, and without the continued diversity to rely on, any of the world's crops could be similarly threatened. Here, in the Jala Valley, these descendants of the Aztecs celebrate a week-long festival around their annual Saints' Day. It's a fusion of old and new, ancient religion and Christianity, but central to the whole week is their beloved maize plant. Mexicans have grown and eaten maize as their staple crop for thousands of years. Every district has its own varieties or land races, each genetically different. Farmers here grow 20 or 30 different maize varieties, but one is unique to this valley. It's Jala Valley's own local variety, a giant maize which grows nowhere else in the world. It's such a celebrated part of the local heritage that there is an annual prize for the biggest specimens. Francisco Ibarra, a previous mayor, started the competition nearly 20 years ago. Today it's supported by official funding from both the municipality and the province. Wednesday night, and the entries are judged in the main square by the mayor himself. The message to local people is that the giant maize is something local that is worth conserving, and it's theirs to look after. If only such popular attention was paid to all of Mexico's rich diversity of genetic resources. Near the capital, other priorities dominate. Sprawling and heavily polluted, Mexico City is encroaching on the surrounding countryside, whatever the cost. Los Reyes is one of the distant eastern suburbs where most of the land has been taken over by developers. Only last year this was a quiet farming area. Local maize varieties are grown in small dusty patches, but among the weeds growing at the sides of these fields is something special. A straggly-looking wild relative of maize, the Los Reyes teosinte. This small genetically unique population is about to disappear, along with the special habitat which produced it. New housing is obviously needed. and the environmental loss will be minor, but this is one of the last populations of teosinte in the entire valley. It's certainly rare that an extinction can be observed so precisely. Whenever local varieties and wild crop relatives disappear, it's a cause for concern because we just don't know what their true genetic potential might be. One of the keenest collectors of maize and teosinte is Professor Hugh Iltis, who has been visiting Mexico and Central America for many years.
Christmas of 1975, I took a photograph I had, and I drew a very nice ear of this teosinte, which is Zea perennis, and I sent these to many people. And one of the things that it says here is extinct in the wild. Well, in 1971, I met a lady, that botanist in Guadalajara, and her name was Luz Maria Villarreal de Puga. Maestro Puga had a student who was interested in grasses. He went down to Ciudad Guzman and spent 2 days looking around. And finally an old man, an old campesino, it's always these interesting old men, asked the young man, well, what are you doing? ¿Qué pasa? What's happening? And he said, well, senor, we are looking for a little plant that's called maicillo, or it's called teosinte, and it looks like this and it looks like that. And he showed him the Christmas card. Ah, says the man, I'll show you where it is. And between two cornfields, showed him some grasses and said, this is your plant. And the average person would have looked at this grass and would have said, sure, sure, Papa, this is fine, don't worry, yeah, I believe you, but would have gone home. It didn't look like anything. It was too early in the year. But Guzman took a shovel, dug it out, took it to Guadalajara, put it in a pot in a greenhouse, and sure enough, by December, 2.5 months later, it was that perennial teosinte. He rediscovered perennial teosinte. Corn has 20 chromosomes. That's well known. Each pollen grain has 10, and when the egg and the pollen come together, you get 20. But the plant that was growing at Ciudad Guzman, that perennial, had 40 chromosomes. So when you cross the 20 with the 40, you get 30, and that was sterile. So it didn't really do much. I wrote Guzman and says I would like to have some specimens of this plant, some seeds. Well, he said he didn't have any. But he said in January, he and his buddy, they went up the Sierra de Manantlan to this place below the saddle. And sure enough, there were acres and acres of teosinte. So he thought, well, I've discovered a second station of Zea perennis.
What Guzman had actually found in the mountains was not just acres and acres of teosinte, but a species never seen before, a perennial teosinte that was genetically compatible with maize. Iltis named it Zea diploperennis.
This second station was a diploid perennial, which meant that its pollen grains had 10 chromosomes. You could put them on corn and you can produce hybrids.
And that could mean the development of a perennial maize plant. The new species, with its tiny, hard seeds, was snapped up by maize breeders everywhere.
So we went back and we described it, put it into science, and all hell broke loose. The whole world came to our door. We got 500 requests for seeds. Everywhere in the world, people grew this plant. Everybody was crossing it with corn to see whether they could transfer some of the characteristics. So it was quite a discovery.
The new find was thought to be so important that the Mexican government rapidly declared the entire Manantlan area an international biosphere reserve for research and conservation. So far, the breeders have not been able to use Guzman's discovery to breed a perennial maize for agriculture, but they are still trying. In other places, not just one species, but the whole local flora is under threat. Far out in the Indian Ocean is the tiny volcanic island of Rodrigues, uninhabited until nearly 300 years ago.
Islands are sort of experiments in evolution, and what's so interesting about them is that the species that managed to get there weren't quite often, they were just one or two that then had a huge place to just evolve into sort of different and fantastic sort of forms.
The fantastic forms in Rodrigues included unique plants, giant tortoises and a great flightless bird, the solitaire. One of the first visitors to the island was the Dutchman François Legat, who found an island that looked rather different from today.
The island is a beautiful place composed of lovely hills covered with great and spreading trees, many of which we saw fit to fell. Pure streams of fresh water are never dry. There are many wonderful animals, most remarkable of which is the solitaire. These are easy to approach and taste admirably well, especially with a bottle of fine Chablis.
In 200 years, settlers and their animals ate the wildlife and destroyed the forests. Relics of the flora Legat found can still be seen today, but only after careful searching in remote corners of the island.
And when I first went to the island in 1981, it's an amazing island. I mean, as you've seen, it's very eroded and it's very striking. But the amazing thing to me was it was nothing at all what the historical accounts, historical accounts that weren't that old, had described it as. And certainly a lot of the species that they described have become extinct, and most of the rest of the native species are on the brink of extinction. Not only do people kill animals and cut down trees, but they also bring with them species that don't belong there. And it's these species that are much more competitive that outcompete the sort of almost weaker island forms. I mean, until people came to these islands, the species on the islands had an easy life. They were truly living in Eden, and they had no nasty herbivores coming to eat them, so they didn't have to develop defenses like plants in other places in continental areas do. So when you've got a system like that, it's all very well until somebody does introduce an animal that quite likes to eat plants, especially plants that don't have thorns or poisons, and they can just totally devastate an island ecosystem like that. All the young plants coming up just get eaten by these introduced species.
One of the island's most characteristic plants is the local pandanus palm, which has been used for many years to make local handicrafts. Even this important tree now has a dwindling population, but a conservation program for all the rare endemic flora has now been started by the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation with some international funding.
The pandanus here, the vacuar that we've collected seed from, is relatively common, but they're all of an old age group. There's virtually no regeneration. These ones here are probably last year's seed, but have all been eaten away. You can see where the rats gnawed off and taken the kernel out. And that's very common. Eleodendron, another endemic, virtually no regeneration.
And that's because of rats?
Presumably because of rats. We have Hibiscus liliflorus, only 2 individuals left in the wild. And directly below that this year, we found a pile of rat-predated seeds. So it's, they even actually climb the trees. The Rattus rattus that we have here actually takes the unripe fruit from the tree itself.
Non-native plants too cause difficulties. Lantana camara comes from South America. It was carried to many tropical countries as a garden hedging plant, and it's now a serious weed in many parts of the tropics, partly because outside South America it was free from its normal pests and diseases. On Rodrigues, it's now a major problem, invading many habitats and excluding the native plants.
Many islands that I visit, you go to this unique island and it's very interesting, and actually I recognize everything on the island. It's just sort of pan-tropical weeds, you know, things that have been moved around from island to island, and they're pretty much the same on all the islands. And the things that actually make the island unique have become very, very rare, and you really have to go searching for them and exploring for them.
Whether it's rare species or unusual varieties, finding these specimens and documenting their occurrence in the field is an increasingly important part of plant conservation work.
There's some 40 species of flowering plants on the island which are unique to Rodrigues, and they're only found now on top of the mountains and in the bottom of the valleys, and some are down to 1, 2, 5, 10 individuals. I mean, you're really at the point where you're counting the individuals that were remaining in the wild, and that was quite an experience.
Some were rare even when they were first discovered. It was in 1874 that Balfour discovered the Café Marron. Since the 1930s, it was thought to be extinct before that one small plant was discovered. The last plant standing is infertile, so cannot produce viable seed. Cuttings have now been raised, but of course, they are only clones of the parent plant, genetically identical. The Café Marron could be taken as a symbol of the whole global issue. The lesson we must learn is conserve diversity. One day we will need it. So is there a future for Rodrigues' remaining species? Wendy Strum is actually quite optimistic.
Management is the key. Management and education. A lot of people who live there, most of the people who live there, aren't even aware that they are living with some unique forms of life. I mean, to them, well, they're sort of normal. They don't. And when you explain to people that, well, no place else in the world, apart from this tiny island called Rodrigues, is this particular species found, they're very interested, and they're quite proud. And I think developing that sense of ownership is really, really important, so people begin to feel, well, you know, they already feel very nationalistic and they are Rodriguans, but that they also have a Rodrigan heritage to protect.